thank you once again for coming here. And we could think of no better way to close out this amazing, thought-provoking conference and these conversations we've had with all of you than to have our next speaker, who really does not need any introduction. If you're not familiar with him, I would recommend you look up his Wikipedia page, and it goes on for quite a while. So I will not go into a lengthy introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, Alan Kay.
Great, that's the best introduction I've had in a long time. Because, you know, a long one doesn't help to talk. So, lots of people are really engaged now in trying to get computing to children. That's great, because I got that itch and urge for a lifetime from the first time I met Seymour Papert and Cynthia Solomon in 1968. And when I was in grad school, I had been a professional programmer before that. I knew when I saw what Seymour was doing, what he was doing, except I'd never thought of it before, that this way of using a computer, these properties of how certain kinds of mathematics and certain kinds of ideas can be lifted by computing and also brought to much, much earlier minds, much, much younger minds. Those things blew my mind. And since Cynthia is sitting here, she'll remember that car ride that we had that first day, because Seymour and I were talking around like mad. He was driving. He was a terrible driver. Imagine what he was like piloting a plane. And I was sitting in the back seat, and Seymour was talking excitedly to me, driving the car, and Cynthia was trying to get him to look at the road. So that was the first encounter. What's going on right now is great on the engagement side of things, and it is also having this kind of spread out effect that happens when things get popular and people get enthusiastic. And so there are attempts to find fits in various ways. And one of the ways of measuring things, particularly in our society, is getting things done by next week or next month or next year or so. And so a lot of things have been going on that are essentially looking at local conditions and trying to do something that, if you look at some of the standards in science that are just now getting looked at in states, some of those standards have been there for 20 years, and some of those standards have been wrong for 20 years. So once something gets in there, it's like chance erosion digs a little ravine, and pretty soon you've got a Grand Canyon that is not easy to move. And so I thought for this talk, instead of complaining like I usually do about this, might be interesting to look at it from a different point of view, which is a long-range view. Because we are in the 20th century, 21st now. Yeah, that's right. And we, as I said here, children born this year will be 83 at the end of this century, and this is probably the most interesting century from the standpoint of human beings being able to affect the conditions around them, both positively and negatively. And so I thought, wow, that's not a bad way of trying to motivate education in slow-moving systems like education systems that might as well be about things that are important, not just about jobs, but about other kinds of things. And so that's what this talk is about. And we have the perennial problems of gazillions of things to learn. We don't know what they should be from year to year. And we have this idea of ways of helping people learn. These questions come up over and over again, and they go at least back to the time of Socrates, if not long before. And we have questions of why. So I'd like to first look at what we should learn. And Basic idea here is, in an hour talk, I can't possibly do justice to this. So I'm not going to try. I'm going to try and use what I think you already know and understand to just bring these things to the front of our thinking again. And one of these things, actually, I forgot to say one thing there, and that is powerful ideas, when we get fluent in them, are like adding new brain tissue that nature didn't give us. It's worthwhile thinking about what it means to get fluent in something like calculus and to realize that a normal person fluent in calculus can outthink Archimedes. Right? If you're fluent. If you have to scrabble around at it, if you're fluent at reading, you can cover more ground than anybody in antiquity could in an oral culture. If you're not fluent in reading, you're still in an oral culture. So part of the idea is there are powerful ideas and there are these fluencies. Fluency doesn't mean you're a pro, it doesn't mean you're making money at it, but it means you're above a threshold where the mechanics of doing it are not in your way and you're able to use this as, I call these brainlets. Every time we learn something powerful, it's a brainlet. And one of my favorite stories, which we know partly because Einstein wrote about it in his later years, was that he was sick with the measles at 5 years old. And to keep the kid amused, his father gave him a compass. And of course, compasses are fascinating because they do somehow point in the same direction no matter what you do to them, and people have used them for thousands of years for navigating. But Einstein said this was the first of a few really profound moments in his life. Because what he said was something behind things, something deeply hidden. So he didn't get hooked on what you could do with the compass. He was able to ignore, which most people can't, but he was able to ignore the thing that was right in front of him, essentially to look at the compass's shadow. And so when we think about what we're trying to do with computing, we want to think about what part of learning should be about using the compass and what a part should be about the shadow. Part of it is there is a shadow. The shadow of the compass is a lot of things. Pretty much our modern world is in the shadow of this compass, because it was the compass that was first used to show that electric currents generated magnetic fields that could swing the compass, and if you swung a compass, a big compass, in the right way, you could generate electricity. So that gave us motors and generators, and the rest of the 19th century and then the 20th century proceeded from there. So this is the theory of relativity came out of the compass because the special theory of relativity was about dealing with Maxwell's equations, which were about precisely what the interactions of the electric and magnetic fields are about. So often in something that is really fun and really interesting and really engaging, there's something that is completely missed. So a good question for people who are dealing with computing is, what if what's important about computing is deeply hidden? And I can tell you, as far as, this is fun, Vishal is here. Vishal runs an enormous company, as you all know. He's got at least 100,000 programmers, right? Yeah. So most of the computing that is done in most of industry completely misses most of what's interesting about computing. So they are basically at a first level of exposure to it, and they're trying to optimize that. Think about that, because that was okay 50 years ago, because businesses weren't that interested in computing, and so they didn't have a huge influence on universities. Now they do. Now a lot of university courses are about vocational training for business. Now what you learn in an AP course in high school just happens to be taken from what most universities think a first year in computing should be. That's influenced by business. We've got this trickle-down effect of stuff that is actually not good for anybody who's really trying to learn computing. It is good for jobs. So a thing to think about is if we're saying K through 12 and not just 10, 11, 12, we need a completely different set of ideas for starting with K, say up to the 8th grade or so. There's a chance of getting out of this potential well that computing has been trapped in commercially that is influencing everything. It is really tricky because now the children because they want to be like adults, they want to learn what adults are doing, whether adults are doing anything reasonable or not. So this is a very tricky thing to think about. So take a look at this. This guy knows that this truck could fall over and crush him, but he also knows there's a person in there. And he's being a hero. Few percent of any group in situations like this will turn into heroes. 2%. Because look at all the rest of the people here. They could be in there helping him. But now he's got two people who are in there out. It's an old lady. Okay, so humans are able to respond when there's a disaster. In this recent awful Manchester bombing, the homeless people jumped in to help. People just do, because the way we're set up genetically is when things are vivid enough, when they're right in front of us, when they're life-threatening, and to people that we don't even know, we'll respond. It's a wonderful thing. But we just can't get our imagination to be vivid enough to deal with things we aren't genetically set up for, especially slow changes, especially things that hardly ever happen. This is New Orleans after Katrina. Well, yeah, it was a hurricane. But guess what? New Orleans is, years and years ago, New Orleans was fitted with pumps to pump all this water out. The only pumps that actually worked at all during the Katrina thing were the first ones put in 1912 by Baldwin Wood, one of my heroes. He was the guy who also he has the basic idea of the pumps that they used in Holland before they built the barrier there. All the newer pumps were never really tested in there, and they failed within a couple of hours. And so we got this. Absolutely could have been prevented like so many other things, but people sprang into helping people here after the disaster, but we have a hard time dealing with disasters before they happen. And it's not that we can't believe in things or have vivid imaginations. We've believed in things like angels for hundreds of thousands of years, and gods and demons. No problem. We dream about them. Witches. Get rid of them. The Bible says to. And why not cats as witches? This is an engraving from the Great Cat Massacre in Paris in the 17th century. If you're interested in weird human history, there's a book called The Great Cat Massacre, and it's about and there's another one called Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, which I commend to you, of things that people have gotten interested in and foamed over and lynched. In this case, they killed more than 100,000 cats in Paris. And of course, they got a bunch of rats for their reward a little bit later. But it doesn't matter. There are certain kinds of things we can really imagine, and the problem is we can't imagine things like this. And I was on actually an imagination commission, this environmental research and education directorate at NSF actually doesn't, it's not like the computer science directorate. It doesn't have a staff. This is a directorate. It's called a matrix directorate or a phantom directorate. It's set up as an interdisciplinary group of members of other advisory boards. In this case, the lingua franca of this group was systems. So there were geologists, there were oceanographers. I was there because I was a biologist and also a computer scientist. And the job of this group is to write books for the president and maybe no more. But when I was there, we did write books for the president and for Congress. And this is one we wrote while we were there, trying to explain to the government just how delicate some systems that seem to be stable actually are, and just how careful you have to be. And we led with something that didn't have to do with the climate, because it was controversial then as it is now. We led with something that is absolutely known to be man-made, which is dead zones in the oceans. Okay, and if you know anything about this, you know there's a dead zone twice the size of Florida outside of New Orleans that is made from fertilizer runoff on the Mississippi River and the Chattahoochee Basin. That gives rise to algae. The algae eventually get rid of the oxygen, and you have this enormous dead zone in the ocean. Why hasn't it been fixed? It's still going on. The answer is the United States has no governing body for dealing with rivers. Every river in the United States is dealt with half out to the middle from one shore by whoever is on that shore, and out to the middle from the other shore, and by state to state. So if you look at the Mississippi River, it borders on a gazillion states, none of whom could ever get together just because things were getting poisoned by, and it was inconvenient for the farmers, and you know the story. So this is an interesting system story, that something that was completely understood of what the problem was, completely understood of how to fix it, was easy to fix it, couldn't get through the political morass because there wasn't a pre-existing authority. And so one of the ways we used to try and get Congress to pay attention to things was and we'd say, look, you know, this seems to be stable. And look, if I poke it, it comes back, pretty resilient. Takes a lot of effort to poke it, so it's probably safe. But, you know, what if the system is like this? Notice in both cases, once that thing topples, the amount of energy needed to get it to either of the previous equilibria is maybe 100 times or 1,000 times more than it took to topple it. Particularly if the toppling is harmonic. You don't need much energy to put one of these things over. So if you're going to teach your children something early and use computers, here's one. You can start off with this, and instead of worrying about some sorting algorithm, which is absolutely unimportant to learn, and it doesn't even have anything really much to do with computing. Really. Computing is about systems. It was only about sorting algorithms for a couple of years in the 50s. It's hung on because they're simple, you can do the thing, but it's completely irrelevant compared to what systems are, in particular systems that have feedback loops in them. This is one of the things that children absolutely have to learn, and they have to learn it early. Because adults are put into a position much later on of being faced with something that goes against some belief that they already have. Well, you can, see, I'll hide my props here. Yeah, so what about the Earth? Same deal. Comes back. Whoop. You wind up with one of these. Think about toppling the major systems of the planet. Most people have not the faintest idea of how much energy a single hurricane even has. It's vastly more than all the nuclear arsenal we have ever made or hope to make. So once you allow this to happen, you could be easily, and I'm not just giving scare talk here, you could actually be producing a 100,000-year event for things to recover. That event might not involve us at the end of it. Can't completely destroy the planet just by global warming and killing off stuff that's around, but you can make it awfully unpleasant for us. So, if we go back to this kid again, what is the problem? Well, the problem is the world that we live in, this artificial world we call a civilization, is really complicated already. When everything is going well, it's still complicated. It's so complicated and going so well that all the people worry about politically is work. That means things are really going well. Because you don't worry about work when you're starving. You worry about food. So these are just some of the things that are more important than work, but they're all part and parcel of the same thing. You know, if you grow up to be an adult, yeah, you have that to worry about, but every adult in the society should worry about the next generation, whether or not they're your kids or not. That's part of the deal. Having a rich life, not just one that copes and gets by. Being a citizen. I just throw in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights because it's worthwhile reading if you haven't read it. It's nicer than ours. And it also has a much better theory about looking at what humans and human rights are. It's not a bad thing to retreat to when you're trying to figure out what you should be doing. And then if you take this stuff, which is kind of when things are going well, and you load on really 100 things. I've just got 4 here that are in store in the 22nd century. The war and slavery and trafficking are going on right now. Drinkable water doesn't exist for 70% of the population. Almost all of the Earth's population does not have good water to drink. You know, to me, that's a moral crime. That's outrageous. We have Trump worrying about whether we should be paying money to help Europe or not. But we've got some bigger problems in the future, and another one is this one. I've just started looking into this again. This is the Kentucky lady who was here. Yeah, hi. So here's an interesting thing that I just got out of a book I read in the last week. And that is the urbanization in the world is at the rate of one larger New York area, or one larger LA area, this is LA, which is 16 million people every 2 months. One New York City every 2 months is the urbanization. And it was just a few years ago that the world went past the halfway point where more people are now living in cities, even in sub-Saharan Africa. So this is an immense problem because if you couple it with the other thing that's going on, which is urban decay, and every other kind of decay, like the entire American infrastructure is way overdue for an overhaul. This is a bill that we kept on putting on, amortizing to the future, hoping some future generation would pay for it. I'm not going to be the one to pay for it. I figure I'll exit stage left sometime in the next 10 or 15 years, but you will be the ones to pay for it. Or you get this force against this force all over the world. So the Chinese are the only ones who actually have a plan. So they plan in the next 20 years to build 300 cities of more than 1 million people each. Think about that for a second. That's in the next 20 years building cities for the entire population of the United States. Because that's what their problem is. And our old friend Carl Sagan had this to say quite a few years ago, but it's completely appropriate. What the hell are we doing? Well, the problem is we can't imagine anything except the flood and anything except being a hero to jump in and save somebody out of a car. What we can't imagine is saving 7 billion people on a much bigger vehicle. Okay, so back to the baby. So part of this is because genetically we're set up for this. Every human being on Earth still has the genes from 100,000 years ago that recapitulate into what is called traditional culture. And anthropologists have studied these cultures for many years, and over the last 100 or more years, and have found about 300 things that are never absent from any of these cultures. Every culture has a language, every culture has stories, every culture has kinship, every culture has revenge. These are called human universals by the anthropologists. So they're things that we have genetic propensities to, and each culture supplies a different set of parameters for these universal categories. So a simple way of saying is humans are tuned to the visible, the small, the nearby, the quick, the soon, the few, the social, and to endure. We are not tuned to make progress. Progress was an invention of the 18th century. It was a radical idea. The word was originally pronounced progress, as in progression. The word progression existed before progress. So, and pretty much every invention of civilization has been something that tries to prop this up or to deal with it or to get around with, for instance, our propensity for revenge and vendetta. That's what the law was invented to do, the propensity for inequity, the propensities for being on a subsistence existence, and so forth. And of course, if you take the baby from 100,000 years ago or anywhere in the world and bring it up, say in Paris, you're going to get a Frenchman or a French woman, because that is the way our genetics works. We automatically start glomming on to all the local parameters for these hundreds of things that our genes drive us to learn. So by the way, if you like Montessori, she was one of the 2 or 3 leading anthropologists in Italy at the time, as well as being the first woman MD. Anthropology was her hobby, but she was deep into it. And a Montessori school is an attempt to embed not this in the school, but the great ideas of the civilization that the kids are growing up into. Because you realize you can't teach epistemology in a classroom. It's even harder than trying to teach French in a classroom over here. Just take the kid to France. This is an old Seymour idea. Goes back to Montessori. And when Seymour talked about microworlds, what he meant was making something that not only was a little contained worldlet of ideas, but also something that the kid could respond environmentally to, not as a lesson, but as a place to live for a while. So these are great ideas. These ideas were used in inventing the graphical user interface at Park a long time ago. So here we are in the 21st century, and some of us are just finding out we live on a planet. Remember, we're local, so it takes some work here, and it's, if you like the internet for crazy cats and flat earthers, you can find both. And in the 20th century, it started becoming, it wasn't until about 1920 or so that people realized that the universe was as big as it was. Up to then, it was thought that it wasn't any bigger than our galaxy. Part of it was they had a hard time seeing faraway blobs of light as actually other galaxies. They thought they were stars for a while. And most of us are just waking up to the idea that it's not just 100 people around us like we have right here. This is a typical human group. We should have a campfire here to really do it, because now I'm talking about something that's essentially literary here in the exact same means that some cave person addressed the tribe 100,000 years ago. Think of the incongruity of having conferences when what you should be doing is reading 5 times faster than somebody can think and learning 10 times more than you can get in an oral thing. And then translate that to school, of just how inefficient school is about getting, and not just inefficient, but in the wrong form. Yeah, so there's not only billions of people, but there are thousands of cultures and subcultures, and thanks to social media, every person is their own culture now, and they will fight vociferously for their own identity in the midst of something where they can't win. Right? You have to be a mass murderer to have any notoriety in 7 billion people all exposed. So this is McLuhan pointed this out a long time ago, by the way, that if we ever had a global village, he said, it would be a disaster because people would feel a complete loss of identity and they'd spend the rest of their lives trying to get it back, sometimes in violent form. And then we have this technological infrastructure. That's a self-portrait of the internet, but it stands in for every other kind of thing we have, including agriculture, which is a product of technology. Every kind of thing that we have. And, well, we just discovered us. Modern medicine really dates to World War II. That's my life. I was born in 1940. So when I was born, we didn't really have it. We didn't have antibiotics. Very little was known about how things actually worked. And again, in the last century or so, we've started to learn about the human mind, both cognitively and emotionally. So these are a lot of systems. So I like to think this is my other context besides the 22nd century. It's the 22nd century out there, and the context we're actually in is this systems concept, the ones we live in, the ones that we are. And I couldn't show it on the slide any other way but by putting up this kind of web work there. These systems are not unrelated. It's just that the words we use to talk about things are single little nuggets. They don't have a glow. So every time we say something, we're saying something that isn't true because we're saying a stovepipe. This is why it's frustrating to talk, because the way we deal with these things is not by using ordinary language. And it's simply we'll just use Einstein's phrase. They're all deeply hidden. The systems aspects of things are deeply hidden almost everywhere, and especially in K through 12. You can hardly find any hint of it at all. Okay, so the big shifts, I just reduced this down to 3 enormous important changes. First one was this 100,000 year one of basically thinking everything works because of angels. And this literally was in one of the main papers written in the 17th century. Bad timing, because Newton was also writing the Principia Mathematica at the same time. But the basic idea is that, you know, if the planets are going around in a circle, then centripetal force should force them out of orbit. So what's keeping them in orbit? And one of the papers literally said, well, there are angels on the other side of the planets beating their wings to keep the planet into the center. So this is a tough one to shake because it's the simplest explanation that our genetic minds can come up with. It's a form of animism. So in the 17th century, we got this, we can call it from miracles to mechanisms if you want, from angels to gears. And this was the scientific paradigm that things had causes and you could track down the causes if you were really careful, and you could make models of the causes, and those models would tell you about other causes. And this change is probably the biggest, in my opinion, is the biggest epistemological shift in human history. Nothing compares with it. And if you want the book that has the greatest leap that has ever been made, it's Newton's Principia. But in the 20th century, we had something a lot looser and a lot bigger than gears, especially once biology started getting elucidated. Anybody know how many cells we have in our body? Like within a trillion. No? Okay, well, it's a good, you know, numbers are sometimes useful. So it turns out, me walking around the stage here, there are 100,000 cells. I mean, 100 trillion cells. 100 trillion cells. Unfortunately, only 10 trillion of those have my DNA in them. Same with you. 90 trillion cells that don't have our DNA, what are they? Well, if you gather them all together, they're all the microorganisms in our body, and it make a slime ball about like this. Just loaded with, some of them are trying to eat you up, and some of them are trying to put you back together, and most of them don't give a damn. They're just along for the ride. So these systems work in a completely different way than gears. And we have to heed that for a variety of reasons, not just for general knowledge, but because for those of us who are interested in children at an early age, this is when you learn it or you don't. It's not that you can't learn a foreign language or to play classical piano at age 40. Most people don't. So for practical purposes, if you don't learn this stuff that is really difficult and really different early, you've got a problem. And by the way, if you look at what they call science, especially in the early grades, but even in grades 6 through 8, it is underwhelming, to say the least, to anybody who's a scientist. It's hardly recognizable. Everybody's having a good time. But the chances that the children are actually learning anything important about science are pretty darn low. And of course, this stuff, which has been around now for almost 100 years, maybe 80 years, isn't being touched. Here's the thing that's really important for you to understand. Today's computing is mired in gears. Why do I say that? Because the kind of coordination you have to do to call a procedure, to use it as a subpart, is gear-like. It is tightly meshed. It's carefully planned. And almost all computer programs have that tightly meshed aspect to them. However, the internet does not. The internet is the size it is, 10, 11 orders of magnitude in the number of nodes that it has, precisely because it is not like what computing was like in the 50s. Not at all. And probably the most important thing I can urge on you today is to try and understand that computing is not exactly what you think it is. Most computer people do not think the internet is a computational device because it works so much better than any computer program they've ever tried. Think about it. The internet doesn't break. An internet attack is not an attack on the internet. It has never been attacked because you can't attack it. All it ever gets attacked is bad software inside the computers written by people who don't understand this. You have to understand this. So what happened when the internet got done and a few other things back in the 70s or so, now 40 some odd years ago, was a big paradigm shift in computing, and it hasn't spilled out yet. But if you're looking ahead to the 22nd century, this is what you have to understand. Otherwise, you're always going to be steering by looking in the rearview mirror. You'll never get to where it's going to go. Every curriculum will be doomed to being completely obsolete before it's ever put out there. Okay, so I'm not going to go through these things. I'm just pointing out that on big diagrams like this, which I urge you to make your own versions of, you can, once you put these things up there, they immediately lead to good questions about education. Because this is a lot of stuff. Like a pretty cool one is that, wow, if you tried to go after this as old disciplines like science and math and blah, 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 you're screwed. But if you notice that every single one of them uses the language of systems to describe it, you could come up with a new integrated way of thinking about these STEM subjects. It wouldn't be STEM, it would be just S. And there's some great books. I'm just going to go through these. This book came out just last week. I got it, I read it over the weekend, and I just loved it so much. This is a guy at Santa Fe Institute. I just loved it so much that I thought about changing this entire talk and just doing it from this book. This is a magisterial book. It's written for the general public, and can't praise it too highly. It's just fabulous. And while we're on Santa Fe Institute, here's Stu Kaufman, an old friend of mine. This is really a crazy book, but if you want to, sometimes when you learn about things, it's helpful to learn crazy ideas about systems. This is a systems book, also written for the general public. Here's one of my favorite people who does get it. So Irene Lee, undergraduate degree in mathematics. She was associated with the Santa Fe Institute. But basically, she understood that it's not about computing per se, because science is the big idea. That's why people even tack science onto the end of computing, even though they don't mean it. It's cachet, right? It's like library science. But science is the big idea, and computing is the underpinning of the new modeling for ideas. That's what and Irene understood this. She's not the only one to understand it, but she's been tireless over the last 10 years or so of trying to make this happen. And right away, once you start thinking this way, you cannot use standard programming languages because you can't make systems from them. You have to use languages in which you can make systems that allow you to deal with things that happen. I'll just mention, Brett is pretty much my favorite young thinker on all this stuff. I think he's one of the most profound people we have around. This book some of you may have read. Very important. If you haven't read it, read it, because it's what he does here is he does what he calls expository fictions, meaning lies. Lies made for explaining something that's too complicated to explain. And the expository fiction he comes up with is just completely brilliant, and you can take it a long way before you get into dangerous areas on it. And what he decided was, what if we just took every mechanism in the brain that is there to respond quickly like a half second or less, somewhere in that ballpark. And they're all over the brain. They're there for, came about different times, evolution. You know, they just aren't a system, as he points out. But he called them System 1. He said, System 1 is not a system. It's just the name I'm using for this thing. And then I'm going to take everything else that does the thinking slowly. I'm going to call it System 2. So this is just complete bullshit, right? But what's great about it is just from staying with that and taking a look at what's actually going on, anybody who's interested in learning, anybody who's interested in teaching can learn an awful lot about really good approaches. In particular, to people who did not like rote learning when they're in school, well, you were right. Because in rote learning, you don't learn you learn the notes but not the music. But the problem is, if you do the cognitive side only, which is a reaction to it, you completely lose. Because the cognitive, the slow thinking, is made out of different fast thinking things. And in order to get really good slow thinking going, you have to have something that is tough. It is rather like learning to play a classical musical instrument, where it's basically cognitive, it's basically emotional, but you have to have the chops. Or it's basically like reading. You have to get really skilled at reading before you forget your reading. And getting to that place in all of these areas is really tough. And with that, take a look at Frank Smith, who's written a lot about what literacy is, and he treats it in a nice, he treats it in a way that's nice for us. Because you expect him to talk about the English language, but he says, no, forget about the English language. It's really about ideas. Because literacy and the literature are there because there's something worthwhile reading and writing about. So we have to think about what the ideas are that we want to put forth all this effort. And we start finding representations. And those of you who know about the history of writing in a natural language, you'll know that most of the early efforts were, in fact, rather in story form, even for things that weren't stories. That's because they didn't know any other way of structuring discourse other than what had been used around the campfire. And it took quite a while. It was really the 17th century when people started to look at other ways of writing prose. Thomas Hobbes, for example, was one of the inventors of modern prose forms. And in between, you've got all this pondering and finding, and these things co-evolve over time. The representations help the ideas. The ideas that you get from there come back on the representations if you're lucky. Unless you have an academia. Because academias tend to freeze some convenient representation to teach. And they tend to stovepipe themselves off. So this was C.P. Snow's Two Cultures lecture you may have read about, where he took the literary culture in England to task for never learning math and science, despite the fact that most of the interesting ideas in the 20th century had mathematical and scientific content. And despite the fact that Newton's Principia had math and geometry and other things in it, and it's a work of great literature. So academia is one of the tougher barriers. And so I just said that. I'm getting older, so I have to put in these little, I hate bullets, but they're now more use to me than they are to you. Okay, so here's a gazillion things of a huge gazillions of things. These are just things I jotted down for ideas of interest now and going forward into the 22nd century. There are a lot of them. Notice there aren't too many that really seem to have too much to do directly with computers, but if you look at it carefully, computing underlies every single one of them, understanding them. So there's just when I use this to criticize programming languages. So one of the things I ask about a programming language, well, what kind of systems can I make in it if I'm a kid? Is it really set up for making things out of simultaneous modules and hooking them together? Well, most of them aren't. Most things are aggregates. Irene Lee uses star logo for doing that. Most languages can't handle any kind of aggregates except for simple arrays. Think about how ridiculous that is in the age of science. It's a complete disconnect with everything except what computer likes to use arrays for. Simulations. Here's one. How many programming languages that you're using with children have units? I can tell you, 0. You can't add 3 centimeters to 5 inches in any programming language and get a reasonable answer, because you can't say that a number has a dimension of inches or centimeters. One of the Mars missions was lost because of that. They programmed it in a language that didn't have this, like most programming languages. And the person who desired the program was thinking in terms of centimeters. The person who wrote the program was thinking in terms of inches. And so a $300 million rocket failed just because of that error, which the programming language could perfectly, if it was in there about reason and so forth. Okay, so there's 1 million of these. And they're not isolated things. Like we see Hamlet up there about humans, but humans are not really isolated from aggregates, from simulation, from systems, from any of these things. And if you're introduced to tiny little ideas in stovepipes, and it's up to you, the students, particularly if you're a young student, to make sense of them between the stovepipes, you're in real trouble. If you don't have a friendly adult who actually can steer you through this morass, you're going to be trapped in a world of non-meaning. So the meaning here, somebody said something that sounded good, is it should be fun and should relate to the kid's life. No. Yes, of course it should be fun, but where do you get the fun from? The important thing about modern education, it is precisely about teaching children not to be like they were 100,000 years ago. It is not about catering to what kids just want to do when they're messing around. We don't want to torture them, but the whole point of civilization is to learn things that are stronger than what we naturally grow up with. So of course this stuff is tough. The real question is, what makes tough fun? Hard fun, Seymour used to call it. What makes hard fun? Well, it is fun, especially if a bunch of people are doing things together. So the ideas here are basic. It's about science. This is Irene Lee's rap. And what's the problem? Sound?
Welcome to Science Wars, Chemistry, Bio, Physics, Medical, which field is best? I understand the force and energy, quantum mechanics and relativity. My field is pure and they rely on me. I see the universe like nobody. You may have made fun of me in high school for being awkward and following the rules. Now I've got lasers. Wow, that's really cool. May the mass times acceleration be with you. Atoms, entropy, dark matter, string theory. If you want to feel a bond, then I can give you a good reaction. The elements that make up life are my essence.
Okay, if I had time, I'd let this is so great, it's on YouTube. It's called Physics Wars. And yeah, so what's great about science is mature enough so it can see what's funny about itself. I'm not sure that computing has actually got to that point yet. It's still taking itself very, very seriously. But in fact, this exists inside of computing, but much worse, it exists in the fortress of computing against other ideas. There's a resistance, for instance, to teaching science with computing, because a lot of the people who are pure computer people, they want to have computing be an essential subject in a high school. That's what they should be asking for. Don't ask for it as a separate subject. What you want is to have the children learn knowledge. Don't worry about what you want. It's really about the children. So let's take a look at this idea. Here's the problem. When people look to see what percentage of the population is naturally autodidactic, and this means not dabbling in something for one's own amusement. Everybody is kind of autodidactic. And of course, we all have to do our own learning. In the end, the learning is actually done by us. But being an autodidact is a person who can ferociously take charge and match themselves up to the kinds of learning, or better, that you would get, say, in a good high school or a good college. And maybe 5 to 10% of humans are that. So not a lot. And so if we're going to do something that is going to change education in some way, this is something we all agree with here, this is why you're here, is we have to deal with this genetic thing that humans have, is that we are set up to learn from other people. In fact, we're not only set up to learn from them, we're set up to learn a lot by not even talking about it. Because in traditional societies, we just grow up in a culture, and that is our reality. That is what we learn. We don't have to go to school for most things. So when this powerful ideas stuff started to happen, maybe back in Greece, don't want to pin everything on dead white guys, because a lot of stuff was happening in China right at exactly the same time, and many of them in the same directions. But it started with the symbol of Socrates. And the thing right away is, when you have a great teacher, and we've all had at least one, right? Has anybody not ever had a good teacher? A great teacher? Yeah. Usually one or two. You never forget them. They change your life. It's the greatest calling in the world to be a teacher. We just have to get the teachers to find a way of learning more, but also finding a way of leveraging knowledge in a different way. So, when we have a problem, particularly if you happen to be on that side of the world, let's invent a technology to help. How about writing? And the cool thing about writing is you can get some of Socrates in there. In fact, Plato was able to get enough of Socrates in there that we still remember both of them and remember a lot of the ideas. Think about that. So writing transcends time and space. And if you know your Greek letters, anybody see what the title of that piece of writing is? There. So this is the Phaedrus, which is one of the most famous of the Platonic dialogues, because it's about just what I'm talking about. This is not as it was in Greece. This was a copy done about 2,000 years ago or so. Yeah. And once you have writing, you can just get a couple of intelligent people and the writings together, and all of a sudden, you've got something that's above threshold. That's a fantastic invention, except not enough books. But can we invent a technology to help? Sure. How about the printing press? And if you like history, Most people think the Industrial Revolution happened in the 18th century, but if you think about what the Industrial Revolution was, the printing press was the very first invention of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is making copies of things very inexpensively. And what you got there is two things. You got the teacher and the students and the book, but once you can make a gazillion books, you got something even better. You got the autodidacts in the room. So here's the dream of the last 60 years in computing. You may not even heard it because it hasn't been talked about so much, but it's coming back. When the computer first came about, people started realizing that besides all these wonderful things it had for representing knowledge and representing ideas and simulating, it should be able to simulate something more than a book can simulate of what a Socrates can do. Not everything, but something more. And so I'll just show you the last slide here, and then let's get past that. So what I'm urging here is, instead of trying to get to the future just by making improvements on what you're doing, the problem there is you're assuming that the present is okay. And so trying to take something, whereas if you go out to the future, you don't have to assume the present is okay. You can just worry about what it should be. And if you think about what it should be using some of these ideas, you can then see what should be going on. You can bring that back, and that can be your longer term project while you're working on what to do next week. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. So I think there's, I get asked to, of course I always talk to the time given, but anybody, any questions about? Sure.
William? Actually, Sylvia, if you could wait for bring the mic over. We have about 15 minutes for Q&A, and Al's kindly agreed to stick around. If you could introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Sylvia Martinez. I was wondering if you thought that Wolfram Alpha was a big step in the kind of programming languages that you were saying don't exist?
Yeah, so and this again, this is a great question, because the future of most commercial programming, let's say 20, 30 years from now, almost all of the stuff that kids are trying to learn to get jobs for is going to be done by languages like Wolfram Alpha. And the reason is because it's sort of TurboTax for our large-scale programming on relatively generic problems that are relatively understood. And so for pedagogy, it's exactly the opposite, because what you're giving the child is a servant who already knows the answer. Right? And so if you think of the problems the aristocracy has growing up with particularly if they hired smart Greeks who knew all the answers. This is part of what did the Romans in. Is for a child, you don't want to give them a language in which you can ask a question and get an answer. So if you made Wolfram Alpha be like Socrates, where when you asked it a question, the system would come back with a question that would start getting the kid thinking about it, then it would be good pedagogically. But if it comes back with the answer, it couldn't be worse. Kind of like, the misunderstanding people had about SimCity, which got every educational award. It was one of the worst things ever done for education, because you couldn't examine the model it used, and you couldn't change the model it used. I got after Maxis a lot about that. The educators didn't care because the kids liked it. They did things. But look, you can't learn about a city if the only recourse your simulation has to crime rate is, the only way you can stave off crime rate is build more police stations. Come on. That was built into SimCity, and you could not change it, you could not find it. And so we have to make the distinction between, if you're learning a musical instrument, you have to do things that are hard. And the pedagogy there is to help you do those hard things. if you're trying to accomplish a goal in business, what you're trying to do is accomplish the goal. And these are just completely two different things. The one good thing about Wolfram Alpha, which... Yeah, Wolfram... Yeah, well, you're thinking Mathematica. No? Yeah, well, I think I've seen, but isn't it the thing that you can ask it?
No, you don't ask it in program.
Okay,
It's really,
I'll look at it. I'll look at it. And if I know Wolfram at all, it does have units. I bet you can add 3 centimeters to 5 inches in it. Yeah, so I'll look at it. Thank you very much for that.
So my name is Patricia Ordóñez from the University of Puerto Rico. My question to you, I kind of was shocked because I think of you as the first person who created an object-oriented programming language, right?
Success has 1,000 fathers and failure is an orphan.
Oh.
You ever heard that saying?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so
But I guess
I was early.
You were early. But one of the things I love about object-oriented programming is that you create units, right? And then you can translate from, or do the translation between the units. And so to hear you say that you want units to be implemented into a programming language kind of, to me, takes away the beauty of what I see with object-oriented programming.
Yeah, so that is an extremely good question. Because, yeah, when we first did Smalltalk, one of the first things we did was to see how far you could go just using objects and making it do the coercions between one scale of dimensions and another. And unless I'm completely mistaken, there's a level where this is actually worthwhile. Like it's worthwhile using an object-oriented language to make complex numbers and to do other kinds of things in the number sphere. Most of the languages do a terrible job going from one form of number to another, and many of the so-called object-oriented languages, the numbers aren't objects. For instance, they aren't in Java or I think JavaScript either. So there isn't a class for those numbers. You can't go and look to see what's there. You can't really add things to them. So yeah, if you go deeper into the dimensions thing, like what you need for science, it actually is a parallel to. Dimensions are to the physical world what a type theory is to type languages. In other words, they give meaning. It's a way of giving meaning, and objects are a way of putting types on things. But I would not try and get a third grader to extend an object-oriented language to put in dimensions. And I absolutely want a third grader, just like I wouldn't try to get them to write the graphics system. Later on, I'd like them to open the hood and see that the graphics system is written in the same language that they wrote. I like them to open the hood and see that the dimension system is written in the same thing. But it's a question of what do you want to learn and when do you need to learn it. Learning the idea of dimensions is much more important than learning how to implement them. So you spread them out that way. Conversely, most of the standards in fractions are given to the children before they can actually derive those relationships, and there is where it really makes things confusing, and to teachers. So I once went around and talked to teachers at 14 schools and 5th grade teachers, and I asked, one of the questions I asked was, when did you check out of mathematics? When did you decide mathematics wasn't for you? And 80% of the answers were invert and multiply for dividing one fraction by another. And you get it in 5th grade, and if you got it in 8th grade, it's trivial because you've had just a little bit of algebra, and you can just derive it. You don't even have to know it. You just set it up and simplify it, and it simplifies to invert and multiply. But instead, in 5th grade, the kids are given a rule that they can't see the reason for. And if you think about fractions, the worst one, which nobody complains about, is multiplying one fraction by another. Multiply the top and by the bottom. Nobody kicks about that because it looks reasonable. Turns out it isn't reasonable at all. It was one of the triumphs of Greek mathematics to figure out how to do that. Right? And so there you've got something where one thing is confusing and the other one is invisible. And both of those, I think, are bad discussions. And I think on every one of these points, that's why I advocate making a kind of panoply of projects before we get to curriculum and standards and those things, of just trying to find out what kinds of cognitive things done the best ways we know how can children at different ages actually absorb into their fluency. Because every time they get fluent at something, it means it opens it up to be actually used rather than forgotten later on. And right now, I see that as something that is almost a project by project, idea by idea basis in computing. I mean, I've been surprised many, many times by some of the things that children can do once we figured out a better, when they keep failing, it's either they're cognitively, it's just not there yet to do the thing. But on many occasions, in the 4th or 5th try, we thought of a completely different way of presenting the ideas, and those ideas happened to be in the cognitive abilities of the children. They just got them in the most exciting fashion. I think we've all had that experience. What I think is missing is, and Cynthia's advocated this also, is look, there are a whole bunch of really important things that were done by Cynthia and Seymour and Andy DeSessa in Boxer, Mitchell Wesnick before he started doing the Scratch stuff. My particular group has done stuff for over 40 years, so we have many compelling examples of really important ideas that children can learn really well early. Those are the things that are scattered. And before I would write down a single line in a standard or a single word in a framework, what I'd like to do is exhibit, like from K through 8th grade, here's 100 example projects of computing helping children learn powerful ideas. Right? That would be great, right? Just put it up on the wall, and then you can sit down and start thinking, oh, none of our programming languages are very good for this. But because I'm using different programming languages to get to. So right away, we've got an impetus for doing a new programming language. And by the way, if you look at the history, and many of you here are just getting started, but the history of this is that going back into the late 70s, early 80s, when ACM started getting interested in this stuff, they kept on picking one language after another just because the language was around. So first it was Pascal, and then it was C, and then C++, Java, JavaScript, Python. Never did any of these reformers sit down and say, we need a pedagogical language. Well, it takes 2 years to do. Yeah, tough beans. Spend the 2 years. Because there's a lot of things you can do while you're spending the 2 years. That is what really frosts me, is just this expediency of taking some random thing done for completely different, even Scratch. Scratch came out of the eToy stuff that we did at Disney, but Scratch was designed for explicit purpose of allowing children in 1 hour to do a multimedia project about themselves in the Intel-supported clubhouses. There are 100 Intel-supported clubhouses, and that was what Scratch was designed for. It doesn't even do all the things that eToys did. And so eToys is 20 years old. It's long obsolete compared to what we should be working on. So this is just a plea for that the ideas that were good in the past, most of them are still good. Most of the mechanism that was used in the past is long dead. Should be, if programming languages were only biodegradable, we do the world and they just never go away. So Other questions? Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Neil Salas Griffin. I run a nonprofit called Code Now. I'm also adjunct faculty at Northwestern University. My question is related to your comments around cities and systems. And I was curious to know, how might someone in a position of influence or even leadership at the city level, particularly in the United States, help invent the future?
Well, so this scale book by Jeffrey West, one of the things that's great about this guy's a physicist, so he got sucked into this stuff the way people and honest scientists often do. You know, he got hooked by complexity, and that most interesting complexities need mathematics that classical mathematics can't supply. So computers come in and you start looking at this stuff. And his special interest in this book, a large part of the middle part of the book, is about cities. And this is not a new idea, but one of the great curriculums in K through 8 is the city building curriculum of Doreen Nelson. And if you haven't seen it, you should look at it. Doreen is Frank Gehry's sister. She knows a lot about architecture and stuff. And this is a real systems curriculum, serious systems curriculum. And I've seen it implemented in the best possible way as early as 3rd grade. It is absolutely exemplary. You know, it takes months to do. It's done without computers. It's done with models. You need a lot of space to do it. But it's an example of what is it that the children need to pay attention to, what is it they need to find out, how do they need to organize. It has political parts of it, because a real city is also a political organization, and if you're going to improve things. So this, I can't recommend this curriculum more in a higher way. And so if I were in the urban environment, and I went to high school in New York, if I were in the urban environment, I would use the urban environment as the starting place. David Macaulay wrote a great book called Underground. I don't know if you've seen that book. It's one of my favorite books. It's what if the street was transparent? What's actually down there? How's the city actually run? It's all underground. So there's a whole thing that could be built out of that. And today, the ability of the computer to simulate complicated things of all kinds is, you can do a lot of really interesting things about cities. I think the vehicle for allowing the children to do that kind of programming, I don't know of one. But since I didn't know about the Wolfram programming language, there could very well be something. I know Don Hopkins, who is one of the guys who did SimCity, has done an open source SimCity that does allow you to get to the various stuff. But yeah, so the simple pep talk is, it's really complicated, but the simple pep talk is science is all around us, like Einstein's compass. And the trick to getting into it is you have to ignore all the distractions that come into your senses. Science is basically about getting around your senses and the quick perceptions that we're set up genetically to do. Because almost all of those perceptions are quite wrong, right? And so it's a bit like learning magic, learning how to get behind the scenes of the magic that's actually going on and finding out that it is, like Feynman said, the really best things, the more you learn about them, the better they are. They don't lose their mystery, they get more mysterious. And a lot of the best things in science, their mystery is part of their art. And we get into that mystery and that art by learning, understanding them more and more deeply and doing more and more things. So, yeah, I think that would be, and that's what I certainly would advocate that to any mayor. Like if you talk to a mayor or I talked to the superintendent of LA Unified last year, and I asked, what is your number one problem? And the person said 9th grade algebra. And I said, 9th grade algebra, if the kids were learning arithmetic, algebra would not be a problem. Because and part of the problem is, if you check, most kids don't really understand what the implication of the equal sign is, because they never really get it. And they never get a good picture of what a number is because they're taught numerals. Whereas thinking of a number is a process of all the ways to make it. So once you get that down in 4th and 5th grade, algebra is a snap. And so I said to the principal, well, look, if you just did early grades mathematics in a reasonable way, there are a lot of different ways to do it. I pointed them to some of the Papert stuff and didn't want to do it because the parents are not worried about their kids when they're in the early grades. They're worried about the kids who are not going to leave home after they leave high school. What the parents want is for the kids to get jobs and to get the heck out of the house. And so the whole political pressure in LA, anyway, is dealing with the high school problems. And for many of these things, it's way late. Because it is really hard learning mathematics unless you've gotten some of these skilled way of thinking about relationships. Mathematics is relationships of relationships. That's what John von Neumann put it. Yeah. So, I mean, it's frustrating because it's like the infrastructure. Where do you start? Every part of it needs to be reformed. I think you just treat it as an epidemic. And an epidemic, you spend a fair amount of your energy on triage and dealing with what's going on right now, and you have to put aside 20-25% of your existing funds to try and find a cure for the disease, right? Because what you don't want to do is to just take care of sick people for the rest of your life. You want, and we're in the century where you knock out the germ.
So would the epidemic be education or what?
Well, the epidemic is, it's complicated because, see, I advocate that people should go to school, despite the fact that I hated many things about school when I was there. By and large, school, it's better. The problem is that I'm preaching to the choir here, if anything, but the biggest problem, what's the biggest problem in English class? Well, the biggest problem in English class is they spend too much time worrying about little tiny things you can test with multiple choice tests rather than what are the big ideas expressed in English. You can't test rhetoric and writing very well in a multiple choice test. California did a huge experiment in the 80s where they tried to go to a really good English and language arts curriculum. Any educator here should look it up. They put gazillions of bucks into it. And it was all about children writing essays and hiring people to be able to help read the essays and everything. It collapsed in part because the teachers didn't want to read the kids' essays. In the end, the testing won out just because it was more convenient. And I think, so when you get into the thing, you have to ask always when you're in the middle of a bureaucracy, what are their actual goals? What are the goals? And I'll just give you one. National Association of Educational Progress, everybody know that, NAEP. They do the reading tests and stuff. Well, just go on there. Don't even bother looking at the high school or grade school tests. Forget about K through 12. The most interesting thing they have there is they periodically test the graduates of four-year colleges and universities in the US on reading proficiency. That is what you want to look at. And just in case you don't want to chase that down, I can tell you that in 1993, the graduates of four-year colleges and universities in the U.S. were only, it was 42% proficient. And if you look at what proficiency means, it doesn't mean really a fluent reader. So that's an absolute scale used over 42%. 2003, it was down to 31%. 31% of the nation's college graduates are proficient in reading, and everybody else is worse. So what that means to me is, this is good because I can ding colleges now. I don't have to go after K through 12. What it means to me is the U.S. colleges and universities are selling degrees, and they absolutely don't have any academic integrity anymore. They would absolutely not, any institution with academic integrity would not allow people to get a degree and not be able to read. Period. It's that simple. So that is a simple one. You don't have, it's so glaring, it's so shocking that but it indicates something that's bad through the whole chain. I don't like the influence of business on universities like I'm on the adjunct faculty at UCLA, mainly for students. But I'm shocked that UCLA is one of the top 10 places in the country, and their introduction to programming course is still C++. What? There's never a good reason to have C++ be the first course in a university. Vocational training, maybe. But Stanford turned itself into a Java school when Java came out, much to the distress of the faculty there. But the provost wanted it because they could sell more seats. So we have to realize that at the university level, the universities turned themselves into businesses, partly as a result of the baby boom. And there's a good book if you're interested in following it up. It's called Imposters in the Temple, written by a Stanford professor. Imposters in the Temple. Yeah. So these are systems problems, right? Because everything is intertwined, and you start pulling on something, and what seemed to be a simple problem is attached to a 50,000-ton weight that's some other bureaucracy that's interested in some other thing. So I'm not saying any of this is easy. And the simplest thing to do is to stand up here and complain about it. But I believe the simplest way out of these things is just take care of the kids that are in high school as best as possible, but take this 83 years to the end of the century seriously. The kids born this year, we got 5 years to figure out what they should be really doing in first grade, and that is what educators should absolutely be spending their time on. You just do a grade a year. And of course it's going to be difficult and probably won't work because it's against almost everybody's feeling of already being in a pretty good place. I spent years trying to talk the NCTM, National Council of Teacher of Mathematics, into the simplest idea, which is combining math and science hours in California. So you get a 2-hour thing every day, and you could teach math and science together as aspects of each other. No way. They had their territory nailed out there, and I spent years in Sacramento trying to make something happen there. So, it's difficult. The cool thing about being a teacher, even though you're not supported the way you should be. But the cool thing about being a teacher is you're in there and you've got the class there, and until they bring the thought police in on you, which could happen, right? But until they bring the thought police in on you, if you've done your homework on the subjects you want to teach them, you can make an enormous difference that nobody can wipe out. That to me that's the big message. The people who really believe in this stuff are doing it in spite of the bullshit. And the only thing that counts is just changing a child's mind whenever you can get them to see that shadow of the compass instead of the compass, you've done your job. So that's a good time to quit, right?
Perfect. Thanks
Great.
so much,
Thank you.
Alan.